Clara Evans stood frozen on the frost-covered porch of her family's sagging homestead, the cold barrel of her late grandfather's Winchester rifle pressed firmly against her shoulder. Through the swirling November snow, two dark figures swung lanterns near the creek, their heavy sledgehammers poised to shatter the ancient stone boundary marker that proved her mother owned the land. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her grip on the steel frame never wavered. "Step away from the water," she called out, her voice cutting sharp through the freezing gale. One of the trespassers turned, raising a revolver straight at her chest. In that breathless fraction of a second, Clara knew that protecting her home would cost far more than just harsh words. The bitter winds of late November 1882 had swept through the Shenandoah Valley, stripping the grand oak and pine trees bare and leaving the small town of Shenandoah shivering under a slate-gray sky. Yet inside Hawkins Mercantile, the frost seemed to settle deepest not from the weather outside, but from the icy arrogance of those within. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans, cured ham tobacco, and damp wool mixed with the warm creak of heavy wooden floorboards under dusty work boots. It was a place where working folks gathered to stock up for the long winter ahead, but on this particular morning, it became a stage for unspoken cruelty. At the wooden counter stood Martha Evans, her hands red and calloused from years of scrubbing other people's laundry in icy river water, carefully counted out small copper coins into the palm of Mr. Higgins, the storekeeper. Beside Martha stood her 19-year-old daughter, Clara. Clara was a young woman of quiet strength, possessing bright blue eyes and thick blonde hair gathered into neat braids. By every measure of dignity, Clara carried herself like royalty, keeping her spine perfectly straight, despite the humiliation she wore on her back. Clara's dress was an oversized, faded gray wool garment. It had belonged to a neighbor's daughter 5 years ago, taken up and let down so many times that a jagged, darker line of gray traced her ankles like a faint scar. The sleeves were thin at the elbows, and the collar was pinned shut with a mismatched iron button. It was an outfit born of necessity, patched together by a widow who skipped meals so her daughter could buy candles for her late-night studies, while Martha waited for their small sack of oats and tin of lard. Clara's gaze drifted toward the fabric display near the window. There, resting on a polished oak shelf, was a bolt of imported crimson flannel. It was the most vibrant thing Clara had ever seen, a deep, rich red that seemed to radiate the warmth of a crackling hearth. Clara lifted her hand, letting her cold fingers hover just an inch above the soft cloth. She did not touch it. Martha had raised her to respect what she could not pay for a lesson passed down from Clara's grandfather, Colonel Thomas Evans, who had famously led a midnight charge during the war. But bronze plaques and old glory did not buy warm clothes or repair leaking roofs. The bell above the heavy mercantile door chimed loudly, letting in a swirl of freezing mountain air followed by the rustle of expensive silk and fur. Beatrice Sterling, the wife of the town's most prosperous banker, stepped inside alongside her wealthy friend, Eunice Croft. Beatrice wore a plush beaver pelt collar, her velvet hat pinned with dyed feathers that swayed with every deliberate step. As Beatrice glided toward the fabric counter, her eyes caught the brilliant red flannel. Then her gaze shifted down, landing directly on Clara. Beatrice's eyes lingered on the mismatched iron button at Clara's neck, swept down the frayed elbows, and settled on the jagged hem of the gray wool dress. A smirk touched Beatrice's lips, a smile devoid of any warmth. "My, what extraordinary flannel," Beatrice remarked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Imported, isn't it, Mr. Higgins? $4 a yard, I presume." "Yes, Mrs. Sterling," Mr. Higgins replied politely, handing Martha her small sack of oats. "Finest quality in the valley." Beatrice stepped closer, intentionally crowding Clara's space. I am thinking of having a winter mantle made from it for my niece. But— She paused, letting out a low, breathless chuckle that echoed off the tin ceiling. It is certainly no fabric for a farm girl. Looking at you, child, I suppose any fabric at all would be an improvement over that garment. Eunice Croft covered her mouth, letting out a sharp, piercing laugh. Really, Beatrice, it looks as though she is wearing a potato sack left out in the rain for a month. You would think the granddaughter of a war hero would have a shred of pride. The harsh words hung heavy in the store. Clara felt a sudden heat rise to her cheeks, but she did not lower her eyes, nor did she shed a tear. She simply braced her shoulders, clenching her hands behind her back to hide her trembling fingers. Beside her, Martha stiffened. Martha's jaw tightened as she swallowed the sharp, burning retort in her throat. She could not afford to speak out against the banker's wife, not when Mr. Sterling controlled the town's credit and hired the town's washers. Clara, sweetheart. Martha said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her chest. Let us head home. Standing quietly in the dark shadows near the back stove out of sight from the wealthy women was Gideon Vance. Gideon was a man of immense wealth, owning Thornridge Ranch, a sprawling cattle and horse operation, 20 miles out of town, with 40 ranch hands under his employ. Yet he wore a faded canvas coat, heavy leather chaps, and a wide-brimmed hat dusted with trail dirt. Gideon had heard every single word. He had seen the way Clara looked at the red flannel with quiet longing, and he had seen the dignified way she held her head high when insulted. Gideon had a 10-year-old daughter of his own, Lydia, whom he raised alone since his wife passed. The thought of anyone ever speaking to his Lydia with such casual cruelty made a dark, quiet anger surge within his chest. As Martha and Clara quietly gathered their small groceries and pushed through the heavy front doors into the freezing wind, Gideon stepped out from the shadows. His heavy boots struck the floorboards with slow, thunderous thuds, causing Beatrice Sterling to turn around in surprise. Mr. Vance. Beatrice gasped instantly, smoothing her silk skirt and offering a practiced smile. A bitter morning, isn't it? Gideon did not smile. His gray eyes were flat and unreadable. He walked directly to the fabric display, pointing a thick, leather-gloved finger at the crimson flannel. Mr. Higgins, Gideon said, his deep voice rumbling like distant thunder. How many yards remain on that bolt? About 40 yards, Mr. Vance, the storekeeper answered quickly. I'll take all of it, Gideon said flatly. Beatrice blinked in utter disbelief. All of it, but Mr. Vance, I was just about to purchase 5 yards for my niece. Gideon turned his head slowly, looking Beatrice straight in the eyes, with a gaze that froze the air between them. You were going to buy it, Mrs. Sterling, Gideon said softly, his tone carrying the weight of an iron hammer. But you were far too busy laughing to open your purse. He pulled a thick stack of bills from his coat, dropped the cash onto the counter, and instructed Mr. Higgins to load the entire bolt into his wagon. Without another word, Gideon turned and walked out into the cold, leaving the mercantile in absolute stunned silence. As he climbed into his wagon, he looked down the snow-dusted street, watching the faint figures of Martha and Clara walking away. He knew where they lived, and more importantly, he knew what banker Burl Sterling was quietly plotting against their land. The storm was coming, but Gideon Vance was already planning his next move. The snow on Main Street had begun to pack tight under the iron-rimmed wheels of passing farm wagons, turning the dirt road into a slick, treacherous mirror. Gideon Vance untied his team of horses from the hitching post outside the mercantile, his jaw set in a hard line. He did not immediately ride after Martha and Clara Evans. Gideon was a man who moved with deliberate purpose, a rancher whose fortune had been built on patience and foresight rather than impulse. He tossed the 40-yard bolt of heavy red flannel into the back of his spring wagon, covered it with a canvas tarp to protect it from the falling flakes, and turned his boots toward the red brick building at the end of the block, the Shenandoah Valley Bank. Inside the bank was suffocatingly warm, smelling of polished mahogany brass polish and expensive pipe tobacco. Behind the grand center desk sat Burl Sterling, adjusting his gold-rimmed spectacles over a mountain of paper ledgers. Sterling was a soft man who had grown wealthy off the hard misfortunes of others, preferring interest rates and legal loopholes to honest labor. He looked up, his rehearsed, polite smile spreading across his pale face as he recognized the most powerful rancher in the county. "Mr. Vance," Sterling said, rising quickly from his leather chair and extending a hand. "A cold morning to be out on the trail. I have the winter grazing contract prepared right here on my desk, ready for your signature." Gideon did not take the offered hand. He remained standing, his large frame towering over the mahogany desk, letting the cold air from his canvas coat fill the polished room. "I'm not here about my grazing lease, Burl," Gideon said, his deep voice carrying easily across the quiet lobby. "I want to see the Evans ledger." Sterling's practiced smile faltered slightly. He cleared his throat, adjusting his crisp linen collar. "The Evans ledger, I am afraid bank policy strictly forbids sharing private client accounts with outside parties, Mr. Vance. It is a matter of professional confidence." "Show me the book, Burl," Gideon repeated softly. He did not raise his voice, but the sudden stillness in his posture made the banker's hand tremble. Gideon was a man who controlled half the livestock shipping lines in the state. Policy was a shield small men used when they were afraid of being seen. Sensing the shift in the room, Sterling swallowed hard, opened a locked bottom drawer, and pulled out a heavy leather-bound ledger. He flipped through the yellowed pages and slid the book across the desk. Gideon leaned over, tracing a thick, calloused finger down the columns of dark ink. The original loan taken out by Martha's late husband had been for $200, meant to repair the storm-damaged roof of their barn and buy seed corn. Yet the balance at the bottom of the page read $448.60. Gideon's eyes narrowed as he spotted the inflated entries. Every time Martha had been short by $2 or $3 on her monthly payment money, she earned by scrubbing clothes until her knuckles bled, Sterling had tacked on a $20 late penalty. "Standard practice for delinquent accounts," Sterling stammered, watching Gideon's face closely. "The bank must protect its investments, Mr. Vance. If a small property cannot sustain its debt, foreclosure is the only legal remedy. The county road committee is expanding, and the bank intends to reclaim the land." Gideon closed the heavy ledger with a dull, echoing thud that made the inkwells rattle. He understood the game now. This was never about a widow failing to pay for seed. The Evans homestead sat squarely over the mouth of the Valley Creek, the only reliable freshwater source for miles. With the new Trans-State Railroad pushing its iron rails through the Shenandoah Valley, whoever owned that creek held the key to the entire line. Burl Sterling wasn't trying to collect a debt. He was trying to starve a widow off her land so he could sell her water to the railroad for 10 times its worth. Reaching into his coat, Gideon pulled out a thick roll of greenbacks. He counted out $450 in crisp bills and dropped them onto the leather ledger. "The note is settled in full," Gideon said smoothly. "Write the receipt." Sterling stared at the money as if it were a pile of hot embers. "Mr. Vance, this is highly irregular. You cannot simply pay off another family's mortgage without their—" "Write the paper, Burl." Gideon cut him off, his gray eyes turning as cold as the mountain ice outside. "And listen to me carefully. If I ever catch you adding fraudulent penalties to a working family's account, again I will pull every single dollar of the Thornridge Ranch accounts out of your vault by noon. Then I will tell every cattleman from here to Richmond to do the same." Sterling's face turned the color of ash. With a shaking hand, he dipped his quill, wrote out the official release of mortgage, pressed the red wax seal onto the bottom, and handed it across the desk. Gideon folded the parchment, placed it safely in his breast pocket, and walked out into the crisp winter air. An hour later, Gideon's wagon rolled to a stop outside the modest Evans homestead 2 miles north of town. The small wooden house stood proudly against a backdrop of dark evergreen pines. The paint was peeling, and the front porch sagged on one side, but the yard was swept clean of debris, and firewood was stacked in neat straight rows against the wall. Gideon climbed down from the seat, accompanied by his 10-year-old daughter Lydia, who was wrapped in a thick wool coat. Together they lifted the heavy bolt of red flannel from the back of the wagon. Hearing the crunch of heavy boots on the snow, Martha Evans opened the front door, pulling a thin shawl tight across her shoulders. Clara stepped up behind her mother, her bright blue eyes wide with surprise, as she recognized the massive roll of crimson fabric in the rancher's arms. "Mr. Vance," Martha said. Her voice guarded her spine, instantly stiffening as she prepared herself to defend her pride. "If you have come out here to offer charity to a widow, you can turn your team around. We pay our own way." Gideon stopped at the foot of the porch steps, removing his wide-brimmed hat, despite the freezing wind. "I am not a man who gives charity." "Mrs. Evans," Gideon replied calmly, "I am a man who makes investments. I bought 40 yards of flannel this morning to keep it out of Beatrice Sterling's hands. But my ranch hands refuse to wear red, and my daughter says it clashes with her boots." Little Lydia nodded earnestly beside her father. "It really does, ma'am." Gideon looked back at Martha, his expression entirely serious. "I need 40 heavy winter shirts made for my crew before the real blizzards hit the valley. I know you and your daughter are the finest seamstresses in this county. I want to hire you at full market wages, and as a signing bonus for the contract, I insist you use the first few yards to make a proper winter dress for Miss Clara." Clara's breath hitched in her throat as she looked at the radiant cloth. Martha looked into Gideon's eyes, searching for any trace of pity or condescension. She found none, only the quiet respect of a man who recognized true dignity when he saw it. Before Martha could speak, Gideon reached into his coat and handed her the sealed bank paper. "Your late husband's mortgage is clear, Mrs. Evans. Consider it an advance on the sewing work. But keep your doors locked tonight. Burl Sterling just lost his leverage at the bank, and a man who stands to lose a fortune on a railroad deal will not hesitate to try something far more dangerous in the dark." The howl of the night wind down the chimney filled the cozy kitchen, but the atmosphere inside the Evans homestead had transformed entirely. The small cast-iron stove radiated a deep, comforting warmth, casting long golden shadows across the wooden walls. On the large oak table lay the bolt of crimson flannel glowing like a living flame beneath the soft yellow light of the oil lamp. Martha Evans sat near the hearth, her heavy iron shears cutting through the thick woolen fabric. The rhythmic, satisfying crunch of steel slicing through fine cloth echoed softly through the quiet house, a sound of creation that drowned out the bitter gale outside. Clara sat across from her mother, her long blonde braids draped over her shoulders, her fingers working skillfully to pin the heavy seams. For the first time in years, the weary burden on Martha's face had lifted, replaced by a quiet, fierce concentration. She was not merely sewing a garment. She was crafting armor for her daughter, a barrier against the cold winds of the valley and the cruel tongues of the town. "Ma!" Clara whispered, her voice barely rising above the crackle of the fire as she smoothed a length of the vibrant red wool across her lap. "Do you truly think Mr. Vance bought all this fabric just for his workers' shirts?" Martha paused, her shears resting against the cloth. She looked at her daughter, taking in the young woman's steady blue eyes and graceful posture. "Gideon Vance is a man who measures his words like silver dollars, Clara. He saw the way those women looked at you in the mercantile. He knows what it is to be judged by people who think money buys nobility. Pride doesn't keep a person warm on a night like this, child, but dignity is what keeps your spine straight when the world tries to bend you. Clara nodded slowly, absorbing her mother's words. She reached into her mother's wooden sewing box and pulled out a small remnant of black velvet, saved from an old mantle her grandmother had owned decades ago. With careful, deliberate stitches, Clara began lining the cuffs and the high collar of the crimson dress with the soft black velvet, adding an air of quiet elegance that no money at the mercantile could buy. They worked side by side in harmonious silence as the hours slipped away. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the dress was finished. Martha held it up by the shoulders, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The high-tailored collar, the rich velvet cuffs, and the full flowing skirt fell in flawless lines. It was a garment fit for the granddaughter of a war hero. Yet despite the beauty of the finished dress, Gideon Vance's parting warning lingered like a cold draft in the room. Martha carefully folded the crimson dress over the back of a rocking chair, then walked silently to the corner cabinet. She reached past the spare blankets and pulled out her late father-in-law's Civil War Winchester rifle. The steel barrel was cold, but Martha handled the weapon with practiced familiarity. She opened a small wooden box of cartridges, racked a heavy round into the chamber with a sharp metallic click, and sat down in the rocking chair by the front window, laying the rifle across her lap. Clara sat on the edge of her cot nearby, wrapped in a blanket, keeping watch beside her mother. An hour passed in absolute stillness. The wind outside suddenly died down, leaving the valley wrapped in a heavy, eerie silence. Then down by the dark tree line near the creek, the farm dog let out a sharp, frantic bark. Martha was on her feet instantly. Clara moved swiftly to her side, peering through the frosted glass of the window pane. 2 miles down the snow-dusted slope near the ancient stone boundary marker that established the edge of the Evans property, 2 yellow lanterns swung in the darkness. 2 men were moving stealthily along the creek bank. One carried a heavy iron sledgehammer. The other carried a surveyor's wooden stake and a crowbar. Clara understood Burl Sterling's desperate scheme in a heartbeat. If those hired thugs smashed the old stone marker and drove a new stake 50 yards closer to the house, the creek and its vital water rights would legally fall onto county land before the railroad surveyors arrived at dawn. Burl wouldn't need to foreclose on the farm. He would simply steal the water right out from under them. "Stay behind me, Clara," Martha commanded softly, her hand tightening on the rifle stock. "No, Ma," Clara said, her voice dropping into a tone of quiet, unshakable resolve. "We stand together." Without hesitation, Clara reached for her heavy woolen shawl, opened the front door, and stepped out onto the freezing porch alongside her mother. The icy mountain air hit their faces like a whip, but neither woman flinched. Martha raised the Winchester rifle, resting her elbow against the porch railing, and leveled the barrel toward the swinging lanterns. "Step away from that stone." Martha's voice rang out across the frozen yard, clear and sharp as a silver bell. The lanterns stopped swinging. Below by the creek, the man holding the sledgehammer let out a low, mocking laugh that carried over the snow. "Go back inside, lady. This is county business now." He raised the heavy iron hammer, aiming a powerful blow straight at the historical stone marker. Martha did not hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. A blinding flash of orange fire erupted from the rifle barrel, shattering the quiet night. The thunderous boom echoed off the surrounding granite ridges, rolling across the valley like a cannon shot. The bullet struck a thick pine branch directly above the man's head, sending a heavy shower of snow and ice tumbling down over his hat and shoulders. The man yelped, dropping the sledgehammer into the deep snow. "The next one goes lower," Martha called out, her voice unwavering as she racked another round into the chamber. The second man cursed loudly and reached into his heavy coat, pulling a dark revolver from his belt. He raised the barrel, aiming straight toward the porch. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. But before the thug could squeeze the trigger, the violent thunder of heavy hooves tore through the quiet pine forest. Out from the dark shadows of the ridge galloped 7 mounted riders, their horses kicking up clouds of white powder in the moonlight. Leading the pack on a massive black gelding was Gideon Vance. He did not slow his horse for a second, driving the stallion directly between the 2 thugs and the stone marker. Beside him, his broad-shouldered foreman Amos uncoiled a heavy leather lariat with a flick of his wrist. The rope snared the gunman around the shoulders, yanking him off his feet and throwing him face first into the snowbank, disarming him instantly. Gideon swung his horse around, looking down at the terrified man, fumbling for his dropped sledgehammer. "Pick up your tool," Gideon ordered, his voice a low rumble that cut through the cold air. The thug trembled, grabbing the hammer handle. "Mr. Vance, we was just hired to—" "Pick it up," Gideon repeated flatly, pointing a gloved finger toward the main road to town. "And start walking. If you stop before you reach Burl Sterling's front porch, Amos will drag you the rest of the way." The 2 men scrambled to their feet, abandoning their lanterns, and ran down the snow-covered road as fast as their legs could carry them, with Amos trailing slowly behind on his horse. Gideon turned his gelding and rode at a slow walk up to the porch. He tipped his hat to Martha and Clara, his eyes taking in the smoking rifle in Martha's hands and the unyielding posture of the young woman beside her. "I see you kept your spine straight, Mrs. Evans," Gideon said with a faint, rare smile. "We protect what is ours, Mr. Vance," Clara replied, stepping forward into the moonlight. Gideon nodded approvingly, looking toward the eastern horizon, where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to break over the mountain peaks. "The railroad surveyor arrives at the bank in 2 hours, Miss Clara. It is time for you to put on your new dress. We have an appointment in town that Burl Sterling will never forget." The morning sun broke over the eastern ridges of the Shenandoah Valley, casting a brilliant gold light across the snow-covered slopes. Main Street was already alive with activity as shopkeepers swept their boardwalks and farmers gathered outside Hawkins Mercantile to discuss the morning's rumors. Beatrice Sterling stood near the store entryway, her mink collar pulled tight against the crisp air, holding court with a small group of local women. She was boasting about the new winter coat she intended to order, entirely unaware of the storm riding toward town. The chatter on the street died down as the heavy rumble of wagon wheels echoed from the northern road. A large spring wagon drawn by 2 powerful bay horses rolled slowly past the blacksmith's shop, escorted on either side by 6 broad-shouldered cowboys from Thornridge Ranch. Sitting on the driver's bench was Gideon Vance, holding the reins with quiet authority. Beside him sat Martha Evans, her posture erect, her hands rested neatly on her lap. Standing in the bed of the wagon, holding on to the wooden side rail with calm grace, was Clara Evans. A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. Clara was no longer wearing the threadbare, oversized gray wool that had made her the target of cruel taunts just 24 hours earlier. She wore a stunning, perfectly fitted dress of deep crimson flannel. The vibrant red fabric glowed like a warm hearth in the cold morning light. The high tailored collar hugged her neck with dignity, and the dark velvet lining her cuffs added an air of understated elegance. She held her head high, her bright blue eyes looking straight ahead, embodying the regal pride of her hero grandfather. Beatrice Sterling's purse slipped from her fingers, tumbling onto the wooden boardwalk. Her mouth hung open in silent shock as she recognized the exact bolt of imported flannel she had been denied at the mercantile. As the wagon passed, Clara turned her head slightly, met Beatrice's stunned gaze, and offered a polite, measured nod, a gesture of pure, unshakable dignity that left the banker's wife completely speechless. Gideon pulled the horses to a halt, directly in front of the Shenandoah Valley Bank. He climbed down, offered his hand to Martha, and then helped Clara step gracefully onto the boardwalk. Together, flanked by the ranch hands, they pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the warm lobby. Behind his mahogany desk, Burl Sterling looked up from his papers. His face, usually pale and composed, turned the color of dried chalk as he saw Gideon enter, followed by the widow, her daughter, and 6 hardened cowboys. Standing beside Sterling's desk was Mr. Harrison, the chief regional surveyor for the Northern Railway, holding a leather map case. "Mr. Vance," Sterling squeaked, his voice cracking slightly as he scrambled to his feet. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? This is a private financial institution. You cannot bring these people in here to disrupt official railway business." "The business is finished, Burl," Gideon said, his deep voice filling every corner of the silent lobby. Gideon reached into his canvas coat and pulled out a damp, crumpled sheet of paper. He slapped it onto the mahogany desk right over Sterling's ledger. It was the signed confession from the 2 thugs who had been caught trying to destroy the Evans boundary stone hours earlier, detailing exactly who had paid them to steal the water rights. Sterling's eyes darted nervously toward the railway surveyor. "This is nonsense, a fraudulent written by common trespassers, Mr. Harrison. As I was explaining, the county will be seizing the Evans parcel under eminent domain due to unpaid tax penalties. The bank will then transfer the creek's water access rights to the railway. There are no tax penalties, and the mortgage is paid in full." Martha spoke up, her voice clear and firm as she laid Gideon's stamped receipt onto the desk. Sterling sneered, leaning forward. "It doesn't matter, Mrs. Evans. The railway needs that fresh water source for its steam locomotives. Progress will not be stopped by a widow and her daughter. The Northern Railway has millions of dollars behind it, and they will take the land regardless." Gideon Vance let out a low, quiet chuckle that cut through the tension in the room. He stepped forward, resting his large, calloused hands on the edge of the desk, towering over the banker. "Who do you think is paying for the steel tracks, Burl?" Gideon asked softly. Sterling blinked, his arrogant expression freezing. "What? The Northern Railway line?" Gideon explained, his tone laced with cold irony. "The timber comes from Oregon, the steel comes from Pennsylvania, and 60% of the capital comes from Thorn Ridge Ranch. I am the primary shareholder of the line, Sterling." The room went entirely silent. Burl Sterling collapsed back into his leather chair as if he had been struck. He had spent months scheming, lying, and trying to ruin a widow's life to steal land so he could sell it to the railway, completely unaware that he was trying to sell Gideon Vance's own water back to him. Gideon reached into his coat one last time and pulled out an official legal document bearing a gold wax seal. He turned his back on the ruined banker and presented the paper to Martha Evans. "Mrs. Evans," Gideon said loudly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear, "this is a 10-year water lease agreement from the Northern Railway. We would like to pay your family $600 a year for the right to run an underground pipe from your creek to our new depot station. The land remains yours entirely untouched." Tears glistened in Martha's eyes as she accepted the document. $600 a year. Here was a fortune, more than enough to repair the farm hire hands and send Clara to the finest academy in the state. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," Martha whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Gideon turned back to the banker, his gray eyes turning to iron. "As for you, Burl, I am withdrawing every cent of my ranch accounts from this vault by noon. And if you and your wife are still in this valley by sundown, I will have the county sheriff execute the arrest warrant for land fraud." By the time the spring thaws melted, the mountain snows, Burl and Beatrice Sterling had sold their home at a loss and quietly left the Shenandoah Valley, disgraced and forgotten. The railway tracks were laid neatly along the ridge, and the water pipe was installed without disturbing a single blade of grass on the Evans farm, true to their contract. Martha and Clara completed the 40 heavy flannel shirts for Gideon's ranch crew, refusing any extra payment out of deep personal pride. Gideon Vance became a frequent guest at the homestead, often sitting on the newly repaired front porch, drinking black coffee with Martha, while young Lydia and Clara laughed together in the yard. Years later, Clara Evans would graduate from university, wear fine silk gowns, and travel far beyond the mountains. But no matter where life took her, she never forgot the lessons of her youth. Stored carefully at the very bottom of her trunk, wrapped alongside her grandfather's war medal, was a small, faded scrap of gray woolen cloth. A quiet reminder that while wealth may buy fine clothes, only a strong spine and unwavering dignity can truly keep a person standing tall.